Hi, my name's Phil Smith and I work at the English Language Teaching Centre at the University of Sheffield. This lecture is about English as a lingua franca, abbreviated to ELF, and you'll be using it for seminar discussion at the end of the pre-sessional course 2019. The contents of this lecture, well, there's 4 sections to it. I'll start by giving some definitions of keywords which I'll be using in this lecture, key ideas and key terms surrounding this idea of English as a lingua franca. I will be looking at different types of language and different types of uses of English in different parts of the world and for different reasons. In the third part of the lecture, I'll be describing some aspects of English as a lingua franca. What does it look like? How do people use it? What examples have we got? And then finally, I'll be talking a little bit about the reactions that some people have to this topic and to this idea. So, to begin with then, we should look at some definitions, and I'll be looking at these key words: language and dialect. We'll be looking at what we mean by L1 and L2 when we talk about these things. We'll be looking at what we think English is and what we think a lingua franca is. Some of these, like language and dialect, they look like fairly basic words, but they can be surprisingly difficult to define. Language, well, we can say it's a human communication system. Obviously, other animals have communication systems. We know that dogs communicate with each other and cats can communicate with each other. We know that dolphins can communicate with each other. But what we're talking about today is the human communication system that we call language. But then, of course, humans have lots of different communication systems. You can wave at someone, you can smile at someone, you can throw a rock at someone. These are all ways of communicating. So what do we think language is? Well, there's key bits to language that are important. There is vocabulary, where there are words, and those words convey meaning to the person using it and the person listening to it or reading it. And language contains grammar, and this means that words change and that changes their meaning, or the word order changes and that changes the meaning. So this relationship between the words and the meaning seems to be one of the key aspects of human communication and what we call language. So that's how I'm going to define language. We don't need much more than that for this lecture. Now, on the other hand, there are many human languages, as you know. This course is based around English, and so most of the examples will be from English, and you can understand what I'm saying, which means that you can understand some English, and you know that I'm using English. We need to distinguish what we mean by a language and what we mean by a dialect. Now, we generally say that languages are perhaps bigger than dialects, and languages contain different dialects. Now, both of them are different ways of using a language with different pronunciation, different grammar perhaps, and different vocabulary. So what's the difference? Well, we say that languages are mutually incomprehensible. Now, these are long words, but it's quite a simple idea. If 2 languages are mutually incomprehensible, it means that one person using one of the languages cannot understand another person using the other language. So, for example, English and French are different languages because they're mutually incomprehensible. If an English person hears a French person speaking, then normally they wouldn't be able to understand them unless they have also learned French. On the other hand, we would say that dialects are similar and they are mutually comprehensible. So we might talk about regional dialects. We might talk about the London dialect or a Glasgow dialect. But the key thing with different dialects rather than languages is that the 2 people speaking the 2 different dialects can more or less understand each other. So somebody speaking the Sheffield dialect can usually understand somebody speaking the London dialect. So they're not different languages, they're different dialects. And this difference is quite important when we're trying to distinguish whether something is a different language or whether it's part of the same language. Let's move on to defining what we call L1 and L2. Now, the L really stands for language, and this idea is that you might have a first language and perhaps a second language. Your first language is perhaps what you learned from your parents, or perhaps what you spoke at home, or what you spoke at school. And your second language, maybe you learned a bit later. You might have learned it in a different environment or from different people. It's usually important to distinguish between these two things, and many people feel that they have a clear distinction between what their first language is and perhaps what their second language is. However, this is not always clear, and not everybody feels this way. Most people in the world are bilingual, which means they can speak more than one language, but they're bilingual in very different ways. For example, you might speak one language at home and another language at work. You might speak one language with your family and another language with your husband or your wife's family. You could be bilingual like this, but the role of the language might be different for different people. So it's not always easy to say which one's your first language and which one's your second language. But on the whole, we can refer to your first language as the one that you learnt first, and a second language is one that you learnt later. And for now, those definitions will be okay for doing this lecture. Can we define English? Well, it's not easy. I'm speaking English, as I said. English seems to be the first language of around 500 million people around the world. But it's not always obvious when something is English and when it's not, because there are very many dialects of English. English has standard forms, it has standard varieties. So there's a standard British version, which is more or less what I'm speaking. There's a standard American version, which is not that different. There's a few pronunciation differences, a few grammar and vocabulary differences. Those standards are fairly well defined because they're well defined by linguists or by people who write dictionaries or by people who study languages. And they say, yes, this seems to be the standard, as in it's what most people believe to be normal, or to be easiest to understand, or to be spoken by educated people, or to be spoken by people in government or people in power. Other dialects might not be so easily understood outside of the local area. So you might have a regional dialect which the people who live in a small part of the country understand, but other people don't. That's normally what we mean by a standard language, is that it's well understood by the majority of the people. And what about a lingua franca? What does that mean? Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, a lingua franca is any language that's used by speakers of different languages as a common medium of communication, or a common language. So a lingua franca is quite simply, it's a common language which is used when two people who speak different languages need to communicate with each other. What language do they choose? They choose the lingua franca, and that means they choose the language which they believe each other will be able to understand. So having looked at where the word came from and the original lingua franca, we can look at a couple of modern uses of English as a lingua franca. Now, we're going to look at, first of all, a couple of regional lingua francas where they use English. One in West Africa and one in the European Union. Now, in both of these places, English is used as a lingua franca by people who do not have English as an L1, as a first language. Across West Africa, from approximately Cameroon all the way to about Gambia, English is very, very commonly spoken, but very, very rarely as a first language. Or as an L1. But people across West Africa can communicate with each other in English. And as time has gone on, this has developed into a kind of West African English as a lingua franca. Now, the interesting thing is that the first languages, the L1s here, there are hundreds of them. People have all sorts of very, very many first languages, but there is this form of English that has developed so that people can communicate with each other. And this is used not just across different languages, but different countries as well. There are rather a lot of countries. There's 10 or 11 countries between Cameroon and Gambia. And this form of West African English is fairly well understood by a lot of people. Now, something similar but different happened within the European Union. There are 28 countries in the European Union at the moment, and there are very, very many languages. Now, the European Union guarantees your right to use your first language, and so it employs thousands of translators for all the different countries and the different languages. But when people from the European Union meet, very often the first thing they'll try is to speak English to each other, because it is the most commonly spoken second language within Europe. And this goes within the European Union and within those institutions. 94% of secondary school children within the EU study English as their main second language, and so it looks like people will continue to use English across the EU for the near future. And this has meant that a type of European English has started growing up, which is used across Europe. And of course, this is slightly different from the standard or the native, or whatever you want to call it, English that is used within the UK and Ireland, where people have English as their first language. And the last thing to say about these two regional lingua francas, the West African one and the European one, is that although they are both English, they're not the same as each other. And if a person who used West African English met somebody who used European English, they probably wouldn't really be able to understand each other, because those two types of English as a lingua franca have changed in very, very different ways, and they're almost no longer recognizable to each other as types of the same language.